Ryan Cole was the respected detective everyone admired, and Julia Hayes was the fearless young officer destined for a brilliant career. But behind the uniform, their secret affair spiraled into a deadly trap. When Julia threatened to expose the truth, Ryan made a choice that would shock his family, his colleagues, and the entire community. A man sworn to protect became the killer no one saw coming. Detective Ryan Cole carried himself like the model of integrity. He was the kind of officer people trusted instantly, the man who always showed up early, stayed late, and made himself available whenever someone needed help. In his small suburban town, his reputation was nearly flawless. Neighbors admired his devotion to his family, a loving wife and two children who often appeared at community events by his side. To those looking in, his life appeared complete, the very picture of success and stability. Yet beneath that carefully constructed image was a secret powerful enough to unravel everything he had worked for. It started innocently, or at least that was how Ryan justified it to himself. Julia Hayes, a fellow officer in her late 20s, was sharp, fearless, and ambitious. She had joined the department just a few years earlier, but had already built a reputation as a rising star. Ryan had been assigned to mentor her on several cases. Long hours in the office turned into late-night stakeouts, and in those stolen hours a quiet closeness developed. Conversations shifted from work to personal matters, and before either of them realized it, boundaries had blurred. The respect of a mentor and the admiration of a younger colleague slipped into something dangerous, an affair that neither of them openly planned but both surrendered to it first. The secrecy thrilled Ryan. The adrenaline of sneaking away with Julia mirrored the high of dangerous police work. He told himself he could manage it, that he could keep his family and his career intact while indulging in moments of passion on the side. Julia, however, did not see it that way. For her, the affair was not a passing distraction but a relationship. She was young, hopeful, and in love with a man she believed would eventually choose her. That belief fueled her patience for months, but as time passed, her patience began to fade. Ryan felt the shift in her tone, the pressure in her words, the subtle demands hidden in her questions. She wanted more. She wanted him to leave the life he had at home and build a future with her. He could sense her disappointment when he dodged the subject or made empty promises that tomorrow he would have answers. Julia was no longer satisfied with being a secret in motel rooms or late-night rendezvous after long shifts. She wanted the respect of being acknowledged, not the shame of being hidden in the shadows. For Ryan, her changing expectations became a heavy weight. He knew leaving his wife would devastate his children, tarnish his reputation, and likely ruin his career. In the world of law enforcement, respect was currency, and once it was gone, there was no reclaiming it. He convinced himself he was trapped, that there was no safe way out. Every interaction with Julia grew more tense, every glance more loaded with the possibility of exposure. She began to hint at telling the truth herself, threatening to confess to his wife or reveal their relationship to their superiors. To Ryan, those words sounded like a death sentence to the life he had built. He tried to reason with her, tried to stretch her patience a little longer, but Julia was no longer the eager young officer he had first met. She was a woman demanding honesty, tired of broken promises and secrecy. Ryan started to fear her more than he feared any suspect he had ever faced. Unlike criminals he arrested, Julia knew his weaknesses, his vulnerabilities, and most importantly, his secrets. The longer it went on, the more paranoid he became. At work, every sideways glance from a colleague made him wonder if someone had noticed the tension between them. At home, every quiet moment with his wife filled him with guilt and dread, the constant fear that Julia would call, or worse, show up unannounced. He lived on edge, his nerves frayed, his thoughts consumed by the possibility of exposure. He told himself over and over that he could manage it, that he could control the situation, but deep down he knew Julia was slipping beyond his control. Her patience had limits, and she was nearing the end of them. He had always thought of himself as a man who made rational choices, someone who could see through chaos and find order. Yet now, he found himself consumed by panic, making calculations not about cases but about his own survival. The image of the perfect husband, the flawless officer, and the pillar of his community had been cracked, and through that crack, his darkest fears seeped in. He wore his uniform each day like armor, but beneath it, he was unraveling. The very badge he swore to honor became a constant reminder of the lie he was living. Every day Julia remained silent felt like borrowed time, and every night he lay awake wondering when the secret would finally explode. For Ryan, the affair was no longer about love or passion. It had become a threat, a ticking clock that grew louder with each passing moment. What had begun as a thrill now felt like a trap, and with every step forward, he could feel the walls closing in. Somewhere in the shadows of his thoughts, a chilling question began to form. How far would he go to keep the life he had built from crumbling? The turning point came quietly, almost like the snapping of a thread that had been stretched too thin for too long. Julia's patience had run out. She told Ryan in no uncertain terms that she could no longer live in secrecy. The weight of the hidden relationship was crushing her, and she was done carrying it. To her, the choice was simple. Ryan needed to leave his wife and commit to her fully, or she would reveal everything herself. What she may not have realized was that, for Ryan, those words were more than an ultimatum. They were a threat, one that could shatter his carefully maintained life. Diane. The days following her declaration, Ryan moved through the world as though on autopilot. At work, he answered questions and filed reports, but his mind was far from the cases in front of him. At home, he sat at the dinner table, nodding when his children spoke, smiling when his wife looked at him, but inside he was spiraling. Every sound of his phone buzzing sent a jolt of fear through him. Every unexpected knock on the door felt like the beginning of exposure. He replayed Julia's words in his head again and again, and each time, the panic grew stronger. The thought of his wife finding out was unbearable. She had stood by him through years of late shifts, dangerous assignments, and missed family milestones. He could not imagine the devastation in her eyes if she discovered the betrayal. Worse than that was the possibility of losing his children. Divorce would fracture everything. The respect of his colleagues, the admiration of the community, the foundation of his entire identity. All of it would crumble if Julia spoke up. Ryan convinced himself that he had no choice. He thought of trying to end the relationship peacefully, to beg her once more for silence. But he knew Julia's resolve. She had reached her limit, and no amount of pleading would change her mind. He told himself she would not stop until the truth was out. With each passing day, the fear twisted tighter around him, choking out reason and replacing it with desperation. Slowly, an unthinkable solution took root in his mind. If Julia was the threat, then eliminating Julia would end the threat. At first, he recoiled from the thought. He had spent his career chasing criminals, investigating violent men who destroyed lives. He had promised himself he was nothing like them. But the more he thought, the more the idea seemed to transform from impossible to necessary. He justified it in whispers to himself late at night, convincing himself that he was protecting his family, preserving his career, maintaining the stability of his children's future. It was no longer about passion or anger. It was about survival. Once the decision took hold, Ryan's training as a detective shifted into a darker use. He began planning carefully, considering every detail as though it were another case file. He knew what investigators would look for, what mistakes criminals usually made, and he was determined not to make them. His plan needed to be clean, efficient, and untraceable. He settled on arranging a meeting with Julia in a remote place where no one would see them. It would be framed as one more conversation about their future, a final attempt at resolution. She would come willingly, unaware of what he intended. He chose a wooded area outside of town, a place where they had met before when they needed privacy. The location carried with it the air of familiarity, a place Julia would not question. For him, it offered seclusion, darkness, and a setting where the sounds of the night would mask everything. He thought about the timing, deciding late evening would be best, when the streets were quiet and his family would believe he was still working late. The night of the meeting, Ryan felt an eerie calm wash over him. It was as though the weeks of panic had burned out, leaving only a hollow determination. He prepared himself with precision, ensuring he left no trail that would point back to him. When he called Julia and suggested the meeting, she agreed, likely hopeful that he was finally ready to give her the commitment she longed for. That trust was her undoing. When Julia arrived, she had no idea she was walking into a trap. Ryan's face gave nothing away. his voice steady, his movements deliberate. In the cover of the trees, with no one to witness, he carried out the act that would forever define him. The life of the woman he once claimed to love was taken swiftly, silenced before she could speak the truth that terrified him. After it was done, Ryan did not allow himself to linger. His mind shifted immediately into cleanup mode. He wiped away traces, removed anything that could tie him to the scene, and ensured Julia's belongings offered no clear trail to him. He thought of every angle the investigators would pursue and took steps to block them. When he left the woods that night, he believed he had committed the perfect crime. 2 days later, hikers stumbled upon Julia's body, and the community erupted. In shock, the department lost one of its most promising young officers, and grief spread like wildfire through the precinct. Ryan joined in the mourning, his expression carved into one of sorrow, his words of sympathy rehearsed yet convincing. No one questioned his grief. No one suspected his guilt. He even volunteered to work tirelessly on the investigation, a gesture that cemented him as the dedicated friend and colleague seeking justice. What they could not see was that he was also the predator hiding in plain sight, the man who had killed one of their own in order to protect a secret. The news of Julia Hayes's death struck the department like a hammer. She had been a respected officer, admired for her bravery and determination. To the public, she was a symbol of service cut down far too soon. Candlelight vigils appeared outside the precinct, flowers piled against the station walls, and the community demanded justice. Among the officers standing with bowed heads and solemn expressions was Ryan Cole. To anyone looking, he was a grieving colleague, someone who had lost a trusted partner. In truth, he was already working behind the scenes to protect himself from being discovered. Ryan immersed himself in the investigation from the very beginning. He volunteered for long shifts, reviewing files, suggesting leads, and even briefing the team. To his colleagues, this was expected. He had always been committed, always willing to go the extra mile. But in reality, his involvement allowed him to subtly guide the case away from himself. He pushed the idea of a random attack, spinning theories about strangers passing through town or suspects from old cases seeking revenge. He spoke with authority, his voice calm and certain, and others listened at first. It seemed to work. The evidence was sparse. Julia's body had been left with little to go on. There were no obvious signs of robbery, no immediate links to known offenders, no witnesses to point investigators in a clear direction. Her phone records appeared ordinary at first glance, showing routine calls to family and work colleagues. For a time, the case stalled in a fog of unanswered questions, but then small details began to surface. Detectives combing through Julia's personal life noticed that she had been more private than usual in the weeks leading up to her death. She had deleted certain text threads, leaving curious gaps in her phone history. When asked about her recent behavior, a few friends recalled that Julia seemed distracted, even stressed. One friend mentioned that Julia had spoken of being involved in a complicated situation but had refused to elaborate. These details weren't enough to point a finger, but they stirred unease. Meanwhile, Ryan began to notice something he hadn't planned for, his own nerves betraying him. During strategy meetings, whenever Julia's private life came up, he found his heart racing. His colleagues were seasoned officers, trained to notice subtle cues, and though no one accused him outright, some began to sense that his reactions didn't match his words. Detective Mark Reynolds, a sharp investigator with years of experience, quietly noted how Ryan seemed overly eager to direct the investigation outward rather than considering internal possibilities. The investigation gained momentum when surveillance footage from a traffic camera showed Julia's car near the wooded area on the night she vanished. Though it didn't capture anyone else with her, it placed her at the location Ryan had chosen. The discovery added a new layer of urgency. Detectives began mapping out the hours before her death, scrutinizing phone pings and travel logs. Patterns began to emerge, and with them came cracks in Ryan's carefully crafted story. Ryan had told investigators that he was working late at the station that night, but phone records painted a different picture. His device had pinged a cell tower closer to the wooded area. At first, he explained it away as a technical error, a common glitch. But investigators, trained to follow inconsistencies, made note of it. They began discreetly reviewing his alibis more closely, comparing his statements to surveillance footage, phone data, and witness accounts. Slowly, a gap widened between what Ryan claimed and what the evidence suggested. Despite the walls closing in, Ryan clung to his mask. He delivered updates to grieving colleagues with a straight face, expressed outrage at the brutality of the crime, and comforted Julia's family with carefully chosen words. Yet behind closed doors, he was unraveling. He replayed every step of the night in his head, obsessing over whether he had left behind some trace, some overlooked detail that could expose him. The paranoia grew unbearable. Then came another blow. While reviewing Julia's financial records, investigators discovered unusual payments linked to a motel outside of town. The receipts were under a false name, but the handwriting on one matched Ryan's signature from official documents. It wasn't proof, not yet, but it was a thread investigators could pull. Combined with his shaky alibi and nervous behavior, suspicions began to shift more directly toward him. The whispers started quietly at first, shared glances in the squad room, unspoken questions in the eyes of colleagues. Could one of their own be responsible? The idea was almost unthinkable, but the evidence was building. Every discovery, every inconsistency, pointed the case in a direction no one wanted to believe. Ryan could feel the change in the air. Once trusted, once admired, he now noticed the way conversations fell silent when he entered a room. The stares lingered longer, the questions felt sharper. The investigation he had worked so hard to control was slipping from his grasp, and the walls of deception he built were starting to collapse around him. The discovery of the motel receipt shifted the entire investigation. Until that moment, suspicion had been little more than a shadow hovering over Ryan Cole, something investigators whispered about but couldn't bring into the light. The receipt changed that. Julia Hayes had clearly been meeting someone in secret, and the handwriting linked to the room reservation was nearly identical to Ryan's. Handwriting analysis was requested, and the results came back leaning strongly toward a match. It wasn't enough to arrest him, but it was a stone laid firmly in the path toward the truth. Investigators widened their search. They combed through Julia's belongings with renewed intensity, looking for hidden traces of the relationship. In her apartment, tucked in a drawer beneath old case notes, they found a small notebook. Its pages weren't explicit, but the entries described her frustrations with someone she cared about deeply, someone who was already committed elsewhere. Julia had never written Ryan's name, but the timing, the details, and her mood swings lined up too closely with what investigators already suspected. To them, it read like the outline of a doomed affair. Meanwhile, the digital forensics team dug deeper into her phone records. Though Julia had deleted certain threads, remnants remained in backups and data logs. Patterns emerged, showing late-night calls to a blocked number that investigators traced back to burner phones. Purchasing records revealed that one of those burners had been bought with a credit card linked to Ryan. That connection was the break they needed. For the first time, suspicion was no longer just a theory, it was taking the shape of evidence. Ryan, however, still believed he could hold his ground. When questioned casually, he dismissed the motel connection as a coincidence and claimed the burner phone must have been stolen or misused. He leaned heavily on his reputation, expecting that years of loyalty and service would shield him from deeper scrutiny. But his confidence faltered during interviews. Detectives noticed the way his hands fidgeted when Julia's name was mentioned, how his eyes darted away when the motel receipts were brought up. These weren't the reactions of a man unjustly accused. They were the cracks of someone desperately trying to hold a mask in place. The evidence mounted. Ryan's colleagues began to shift their perspective. At first, many resisted the idea that one of their own could be guilty. But loyalty only went so far. When faced with the mounting inconsistencies, their doubt grew. Detective Mark Reynolds, who had quietly suspected Ryan early on, became more vocal. He argued that the department could no longer ignore the facts simply because they involved a fellow officer. Reluctantly, others began to agree. The investigation was no longer about a faceless attacker or a revenge-driven criminal. It was about betrayal from within. The turning point came when investigators analyzed Ryan's movements on the night. Julia disappeared. His official log stated he was at the precinct until after midnight, but his car's GPS data told another story. He had driven out of town to the wooded area where Julia's body was later discovered, then returned hours later. The timing matched almost perfectly with Julia's last known phone activity. With GPS data, motel receipts, burner phones, and the personal notes from Julia's apartment, the narrative tightened into a noose that Ryan's sense of control slipped entirely. Once, he had been the man steering the investigation, directing suspicion elsewhere. Now, he was the target, every discovery, cutting away at the lies he had carefully woven. He tried to maintain the facade, showing up to work, offering theories, pretending to grieve, but the eyes of his colleagues told him it was over. They no longer looked at him with respect. They looked at him with suspicion, even contempt. The badge he had once polished with pride became an unbearable weight. It no longer symbolized honor. It symbolized the hypocrisy of a man who had sworn to uphold the law, yet had used his training to commit the ultimate betrayal. Investigators confronted him with the evidence piece by piece, watching his defenses crumble. When shown the GPS data, he muttered explanations that contradicted his earlier statements. When asked about the burner phones, his excuses fell apart under scrutiny. Each answer he gave only drew him deeper into a web he could not escape. The unraveling of Ryan Cole was slow but inevitable. The secrets he had worked so hard to bury were now spread out across evidence tables, pinned to investigation boards, and whispered about in hallways. Julia Hayes had once threatened to expose the truth, and in the end, she did, but not with words. It was the trail she left behind, the traces of her struggle for honesty, that brought Ryan down. By the time investigators prepared their case for prosecution, the portrait was clear: a decorated officer who had murdered his colleague. To silence her, a man who chose destruction over confession. His betrayal wasn't just to Julia, but to his family, his community, and the very oath he had sworn. For those who had once admired him, the truth was devastating. For Ryan, it was the beginning of the end. The trial of Detective Ryan Cole became one of the most watched cases in the region. A police officer accused of murdering his own colleague was a scandal that captured national headlines. Reporters filled the courthouse steps each morning, their cameras flashing as Ryan was escorted inside in handcuffs, his once respected badge replaced by the cold reality of being a defendant in a murder trial. For the public, the case was more than just a story of crime and punishment. It was a betrayal of trust, a reminder that evil could wear a uniform and hide behind the mask of authority. Inside the courtroom, prosecutors built their case piece by piece, carefully laying out the evidence that pointed directly at Ryan. They began with motive. Julia Hayes had confided in friends about a relationship with a man who could not leave his current life. Though she had never named him outright, her words painted a picture that fit Ryan perfectly. The jury heard about her growing frustration, her threats to reveal the truth, and the pressure she placed on her secret lover to make a choice. The motive was clear. Ryan had everything to lose if Julia exposed the affair. From there, the prosecution introduced the physical and digital evidence. They showed the motel receipts with handwriting tied to Ryan, the burner phones traced back to his purchases, and the GPS data from his car that placed him in the wooded area the night Julia disappeared. Each piece of evidence stacked on top of the other, creating a chain too strong to break. They argued that Ryan, with his knowledge of police procedure, thought he could outsmart the system. Instead, his attempts to cover his tracks revealed his guilt. The defense tried to paint a different picture. They claimed the evidence was circumstantial, that coincidences had been twisted to fit a narrative. They argued that the motel receipts could have been used by anyone, that GPS data could be inaccurate, that Julia may have been seeing someone else whose identity was still unknown. They portrayed Ryan as a loyal husband and father being targeted by colleagues who turned on him when the investigation became desperate. But as the trial unfolded, the defense's arguments felt hollow compared to the weight of the prosecution's case. Witness testimony deepened the blow. Julia's friends spoke about her emotional turmoil in the weeks before her death. One described Julia's insistence that she was tired of being a secret, that she planned to confront her lover and demand change. Another recalled how Julia had mentioned that if the truth came out, it would destroy a man's entire life. For the jury, these accounts tied directly into Ryan's motive, reinforcing the story prosecutors had laid out. Perhaps the most devastating moment came when investigators took the stand. They described how Ryan's behavior during the investigation struck them as odd, how he pushed theories of random attacks while avoiding questions about Julia's private life. They detailed how his alibi collapsed under scrutiny, how his explanations for the burner phones and GPS data fell apart when pressed, coming from fellow officers, men and women who once stood by him. The testimony carried an extra weight. It was betrayal speaking against betrayal. The jury listened intently, their expressions growing darker with each passing day. They saw a man who had sworn to protect the innocent but had instead silenced a woman he claimed to care for. They saw a decorated officer who believed he could use his badge as a shield against accountability. And they saw the shattered family, sitting quietly in the back of the courtroom, his wife and children, caught in the wreckage of his decisions, their lives forever altered. When the time came for closing arguments, the prosecution left the jury with a chilling reminder. They said Ryan Cole's crime was not only a murder but a betrayal of trust, that he had abused his position, manipulated those around him, and taken the life of a colleague to preserve his own image. They asked the jury to see past the uniform and deliver justice for Julia Hayes. Deliberations did not take long. After only a few hours, the jury returned with their verdict. Guilty. Ryan Cole was convicted of murder, his fate sealed by the very system he had once served. As the words were read aloud, the courtroom fell into heavy silence. Ryan sat motionless, his face drained of color, while behind him his wife wept quietly. The badge that had once defined him was gone, replaced with the label of murderer. The sentencing followed weeks later. The judge delivered a life sentence, condemning Ryan to spend the rest of his years behind bars. In his statement, the judge called the crime an act of cold calculation, carried out by a man who placed his own desires above the life of another. For Julia's family, the verdict brought a measure of justice, though no verdict could restore what they had lost. For Ryan's family, it was a different kind of loss, watching the man they loved transformed into a stranger they could no longer trust. The community never forgot. For years, people spoke about the case in hushed tones, recalling the shock of realizing that a man sworn to uphold the law had used his skills to destroy a life. Julia's name lived on in memorials and ceremonies, remembered as a bright young officer with a future stolen too soon. Ryan's name became a cautionary tale, a reminder that secrets have a way of surfacing and that even those who know the law cannot escape its reach.